Right now, I do want to take you to some of the big stories that we are covering at this hour, and you are taking a live look over Cuba as U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the U.S. will not simply take the Cuban government's word on what happened Wednesday when Cuban soldiers fatally shot several people aboard a speedboat registered out of Florida. The Cuban government claims the speedboat entered Cuban waters and opened fire on Cuban soldiers, leading to that shootout that killed 4 people on the U.S. vessel and wounded 6 others. Rubio says the U.S. is working to figure out whether the victims were American citizens or permanent residents and piece together how it all played out. He explained this was not a U.S. government operation.
We immediately began to look into it. As it stands now, the Department of Homeland Security, the Coast Guard, others are involved. We're going to find out exactly what happened here, and then we'll respond accordingly. The authorities in Cuba, the border guard has constant contact with the Coast Guard. So oftentimes in these incidents and things like this, the initial reports are incomplete. I reached out and we began to look at it independently. We have various different elements of the U.S. government that are trying to verify elements of the story.
And Cuba's government says that 1 Cuban officer was injured in the shootout. The extent of the injuries, the conditions of the other 6 on board that American vessel are not known at this point. I do want to bring in Connor Pfeiffer with FDD Action to break down a little bit more about the situation and how all this played out, what to expect as the investigation continues. Connor, thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's great to be with you, Josh.
And Connor, I wanted to start off by talking to you a little bit more about what we know and, as I mentioned, what we don't know. What do we know about the people who were on board that vessel that was registered to Florida? Do we have a lot of information about that just yet?
Josh, all we know so far is what's been released by the Cuban government, which I think Secretary Rubio has indicated should be treated with appropriate skepticism until verified by the United States. What the Cuban government has said is that 10 individuals of Cuban descent, all Cuban Americans likely, but we don't know their status for sure, of course, approached the Cuban shore on a boat registered in Florida. And the Cuban government alleges that they were armed and attempting to infiltrate Cuba and commit what the Cuban government says are acts of terrorism. And so they alleged that the Cuban Coast Guard was fired upon, and then that the Cuban Coast Guard returned fire. And so there were several fatalities, and others were injured and taken into Cuban custody and given medical care. That's what the Cuban government says, of course. The reason to be appropriately skeptical is that in past incidents, the Cuban government has not been necessarily truthful about what has happened. I'll give you one example. So in 1996, there was an incident called the Brothers to the Rescue, where the Cuban government shot down 2 civilian airplanes outside of Cuban airspace that were attempting to fly over Cuba and drop leaflets. So they weren't armed, they were civilian aircraft. And the Cuban government still alleges to this day that they were threatening Cuba and that using force against civilian airplanes was the appropriate response. And so given that history and other past incidents, it's appropriate for the United States to conduct its own investigation. As you showed in the images earlier, we have a U.S. embassy in Cuba on the ground. We are, as Rubio said, we're in regular touch with their border guard as well. So the U.S. is going to gather facts here to figure out what exactly happened.
And explain to me what we know about how the investigation could play out. Again, as we mentioned, there are several different agencies that are involved in all of this. We did hear, of course, from Rubio, who said that we're not just going to take the word of anything that the Cuban government has to say. So where do we kind of go from here to find out more information?
Josh, there are a few avenues I think that'll be used to get more information. Obviously, as I mentioned, there's some U.S. presence in Cuba itself, given our diplomatic posts there, as well as regular contacts with their border guard. The other thing to keep in mind is, obviously, Cuba is only 90 miles from Key West, Florida. And there's significant military installations in the Keys, including the Naval Air Station in Key West, with radars and other military assets there. And so it's likely that the U.S., through civilian and military assets, can try to put together a better picture of what happened based on our information alone and not solely relying on what the Cubans have said.
And it is important to note here that we're talking about U.S. side versus Cuban side as far as the waters themselves. So how does that maybe muddy the situation in general? And again, you kind of already touched on that, but how does that change things?
Well, obviously, the incident allegedly happened only 1 mile off of Cuba's shore, so much closer to Cuba than to the United States. And that would, if that's true, be within Cuba's 12-mile territorial waters. And so they would obviously have a better picture in theory on what happened there. But again, the U.S. is not going to just take Cuba's word for it. And so Secretary Rubio is right to express that appropriate skepticism and see what the U.S. can find out on our own about what actually happened there.
If the U.S. does determine that there was improper action conducted by Cuba, what does that say? What are the options there that could take place? Because I have to imagine the already fractured relationship becomes even more fractured.
Josh, I think there's a few actions the U.S. can take in response. As you know, the U.S. has already imposed a quarantine on oil shipments going into Cuba, which has caused significant issues for the Cuban regime in order to keep the lights on, for instance, to supply gasoline and power their economy. There are other options the U.S. can implement with regard to sanctions, for instance, looking at secondary sanctions on foreign companies that facilitate, for instance, tourism from Europe and Canada to Cuba, which provides revenue for the Cuban military, which operates many of the tourist resorts and hotels. I think it's telling that you have billions of dollars that the companies, including GESA, associated with the Cuban military, have in the bank, yet at the same time, the Cuban government is barely able to fuel its own economy and provide resources to the Cuban people. You literally have trash piling up all over the country because they don't have enough fuel to fuel the garbage trucks, literally in Cuba right now. And so the U.S. has additional pressure points that they exert to put pressure on the Cuban regime, as well as in the specific regards to the specific incident. Of course, if they're American citizens demanding that U.S. personnel at our diplomatic posts there have access to them to provide consular services and make sure that they're being treated well.
And as we look at all of this, again, as we mentioned, it's very early in the investigation. Rubio said he's not going to speculate about what happened. He just wants to kind of gather the facts and see all of this as it played out, piece it all together. How uncommon is a situation like this? Again, we're talking about what sounds as though it could have been a shootout there about a mile or so away from the Cuban water. So explain that all to me.
Josh, it's fairly uncommon, I think, as Rubio alluded to see an exchange of fire on the open seas, especially between the U.S. and Cuba, if that's actually what happened, of course, relying on the Cuban account there. You've seen many incidents in the past of speedboats and other boats transiting between the U.S. and Cuba. Famously, hundreds of thousands of Cubans over the past several decades have escaped from Cuba using that route in the Straits of Florida. And so the boat traffic there is not unusual. But of course, what's unusual here is potential fatalities and exchange of gunfire. And so I think it is appropriate to take some time to investigate this, given that it is such an unusual circumstance.
All right, Connor Pfeiffer, thank you so much for being here with us. Again, you kind of already touched on this, but my last question for you, the relationship here between the U.S. and Cuba, how has it kind of changed over the last several years, several decades? Where do we stand now?
Josh, that incident I mentioned earlier, the Brothers to the Rescue shoot down in 1996, is actually what pushed Congress to pass what's called the Helms-Burton Act, which codified the U.S. embargo on Cuba and officially articulated in law U.S. policy to seek a change in regime in Cuba. And so since the Helms-Burton Act, you've had a U.S. posture, even after the Cold War, of seeking to increase pressure on the Cuban regime and to ultimately move towards political and economic reforms on the island. During the Obama administration, you saw an attempt to open up relations with Cuba. We opened an embassy in Havana. President Obama traveled to Cuba. Many people, including myself, think that was a mistake because the Cuban regime hasn't reformed itself and remains a state sponsor of terrorism. And what you've seen in recent years is increasing frustration on the U.S. side that many of the promised reforms during the Obama administration by the Cuban side have not taken place, and the Cuban people remain oppressed by the Cuban regime. And so what the Trump administration is doing now is fully following through on the commitment in the Helms-Burton Act and under U.S. policy to seek real, as Rubio has called it, dramatic reforms in Cuba to move towards an eventual transition.
Connor Pfeiffer, thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to break it all down. We appreciate your expertise, your knowledge of the situation. Anything we missed, anything that you want to make sure that you add here before I let you go?
I think a key thing for people to keep in mind, Josh, is its longstanding U.S. policy to impose significant pressure on Cuba. Just because many U.S. partners, including Europe and Canada, continue to allow significant tourism and relations with Cuba, doesn't mean that U.S. policy has changed. And so, what the Trump administration is doing here, imposing pressure on Cuba, holding them accountable for their alliances with China, Russia, and other U.S. adversaries, calling them out for their support of intelligence facilities for U.S. adversaries to spy on the United States. This is longstanding U.S. policy that advances our national security.
Connor, thank you again for being here with us. We definitely appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll be in touch here as we see this investigation itself play out.
Thanks so much, Josh.
And I want to pop up this live look at this hour over Cuba. As I mentioned, the investigation does continue here. And we also have this post from the Department of State, of course, Secretary Rubio, as we heard, saying, what I'm telling you is we're going to find out exactly what happened and who was involved. We're not going to just take what somebody else tells us. I'm very confident we will be able to know the story independently. Now, of course, the Cuban government, as we mentioned, claiming that the speedboat entered Cuban waters and opened fire on those soldiers, leading to an overall shootout that killed 4 people on the U.S. vessel and wounded 6 others. Unclear on the conditions of those other 6. But again, we'll keep you updated as we always do here on Live Now from Fox. We are going to head to a quick 2-minute commercial break, but a lot more live coverage coming up in just a few. Stay with us here on Live Now from Fox.